My mother-in-law stole my wedding dress and left a clown costume with a note that said, "Know your place." So I wore it down the aisle and destroyed her family in front of 200 guests. I found the note at 9:17 on the night before my wedding. Black ink, neat cursive, 3 words. Know your place. My dress was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The garment bag hung open on the closet door of the bridal suite at Larkspur Hill Estate. Empty. The zipper pulled all the way down like a mouth. In its place, on the same padded hanger, hung a clown costume. Red and white stripes. Oversized buttons down the front. A ruffled collar stiff enough to hold its shape without a neck inside it. A foam nose sat in the breast pocket, orange and slightly dented, like it had been squeezed once by someone testing whether it would honk. My name is Ren Ashby. I'm 31 years old. I work in financial compliance for a risk advisory firm in Manhattan, the kind of job where my entire function is noticing when numbers don't behave the way people say they behave. I catch people who think they're too careful, or too rich, or too protected to get caught. 22 months earlier, I had gotten engaged to a man named Holt Sterling. In 4 hours, I was supposed to marry him in front of 200 guests on a lawn that cost $11,000 a day to rent. His mother, Vivian Sterling, had never liked me. She'd made that clear at our engagement dinner in front of 12 people when she looked at my dress, a navy sheath from a department store. Nothing fancy. Exactly what a compliance analyst on a compliance analyst's salary could afford, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Well, she's certainly ordinary, isn't she?" Holt laughed. Not a mean laugh he'd have told you. A nervous one. A please don't make this a thing one. It didn't matter what kind it was. I heard it, and I never fully unheard it. I stood in that bridal suite at 9:17 p.m., holding a note in my hand, staring at a costume that had replaced $8,000 of hand-beaded silk, and I understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was that Vivian Sterling had just declared war the night before her son's wedding. The second was that she had absolutely no idea who she was declaring it against. My maid of honor, Meena Kapoor, walked in behind me carrying 2 glasses of champagne we were never going to drink and went completely still in the doorway. My father, Arthur Ashby, was by the window, checking his phone for the weather forecast one more time, the way he'd done every hour for 2 days. He looked up at the sound of Meena's glass hitting the carpet, and his whole face changed. "Call security," said my other bridesmaid, Tess Bridger, already reaching for her phone. "Call Holt. Call somebody." "No," I said. I wasn't calm because I was calm. I was calm because I had spent 11 months building something Vivian didn't know existed, and some detached procedural part of my brain, the part that spent its days reading wire transfer logs, was already doing math. 11 months of documentation, 6 weeks with a forensic accountant, a lawyer who'd reviewed the file twice and told me it would survive scrutiny, a folder I had carried in a $2 plastic document holder to every family dinner, every shower, every fitting, waiting for the right room to open it in. Vivian had just handed me the room. My father crossed to me slowly, the way he used to when I was small and upset about something he couldn't fix with a wrench. He didn't ask what I wanted to do. He knew me better than that. "Tell me what you need," he said. I looked at the costume one more time, at the note, at the foam nose sitting in that pocket like a punchline waiting to be delivered. "Zip me into it," I said. "The costume, not the dress. The costume." Meena made a sound like she'd been hit in the stomach. "Ren, I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm not calling this off, and I'm not spending tomorrow morning crying into a hotel pillow because Vivian Sterling wants a reaction. I'm walking down that aisle exactly the way she dressed me, and then I'm going to explain to 200 people why." Nobody argued with me after that. My father zipped the costume up my back, his hands steady in a way I knew his hands weren't. Not really. I kept my white heels. I left the foam nose in my clutch instead of on my face. Some lines, even in a clown suit, I intended to hold. The next morning, the string quartet started the processional at 11:15. 200 guests stood. My father held out his arm at the top of the staircase, and I took it, red and white stripes catching the light through the estate's tall windows, and we started down the aisle together. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then it didn't. To understand why I put on that costume instead of falling apart, you have to understand who I was before I met the Sterlings, and who Vivian had been doing this kind of thing to for a very long time. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom house my father wired himself. Twice, once when I was 7, and the fuse box gave out for good, and once when I was 14 and we added a room after my grandmother moved in. My mother, Louise, taught 3rd grade at a public school 2 miles from that house. She died when I was 19, breast cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral. My father raised me alone through the back half of college on an electrician's income, and never once made me feel like it cost him anything, even though I know now that it cost him almost everything. I tell you this because when Vivian Sterling called me ordinary at that engagement dinner, she thought she was describing my clothes. She was actually describing the 2 people who raised me, and she had no idea she'd said something I would carry like a compliment. I met Holt Sterling 5 years ago, at a mutual friend's engagement party in a rooftop bar in the Flatiron District. He was easy to talk to in a way I didn't expect from someone whose family had a wing of a hospital named after them. He asked good questions. He remembered small details from earlier in the conversation and brought them back up later, which is a rarer trait than people think. By the time the party ended, I'd given him my number, and by the time we'd been dating 6 months, I understood the shape of his family without having met most of them. His father, Nathaniel Sterling, had built a real estate and private equity fortune over 4 decades before dying of a heart attack at a fundraising gala 6 years earlier. The same year, Holt turned 27. Nathaniel had founded the Sterling Family Foundation in the 80s, and it funded scholarships across 3 counties in Connecticut and had paid for the cardiac wing at Greenwich General, which is why the building has his name carved into limestone above the entrance. Holt's older brother, Graham, 36, had stepped into the foundation's day-to-day operations after their father died, and he ran it the way he did everything, earnestly, competently, and with total, uncomplicated trust in his mother, who had taken over as board chair the same year. In those early years, before Vivian became the weather system I had to plan every visit around, Holt and I built something ordinary and good that had nothing to do with his last name. We spent Sunday mornings at a diner 2 blocks from my apartment in Astoria that did a bottomless coffee refill and terrible home fries we ordered anyway. He learned to cook exactly one dish, a bolognese his father had apparently taught him as a teenager, and made it for me on my birthday every year without fail. I learned the names of his college roommates before I learned the names of most of his relatives, because those were the friendships he actually valued, the ones nobody's money had arranged. When my father had a minor heart scare 2 years into our relationship, Holt drove me to Dayton overnight without being asked, sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours with a man he'd met exactly twice, and brought him a Reds cap from the gift shop because he'd noticed, on the drive, that my father had mentioned the team once. I fell in love with that version of him, the version that existed at full size only when his mother wasn't in the room. It took me longer than it should have to notice how small he got the moment she walked in. Holt was easy. Vivian was not. I met her properly 4 months into dating Holt, at a Sunday dinner at the Sterling House in Greenwich, a stone colonial with a circular driveway and a housekeeper named Priya, who I liked immediately and who I noticed, even then, moved through that house like someone permanently bracing for a storm. Vivian was 60 at the time, sharp-featured, dressed the way people dress when they've never once had to consider the price of anything. She shook my hand, looked me over once, top to bottom, in under 2 seconds and said, "So you're the one Holton's been keeping to himself." I didn't know yet that Holton was a name she used when she wanted her son to remember whose son he was. The engagement dinner came a year and a half later, at a private room in a restaurant on Greenwich Avenue called Le Chevalier. 12 people, white tablecloths, a violinist Vivian had hired without asking anyone. I wore a navy sheath dress from a department store, the same dress I'd worn to 2 work events and a cousin's baby shower, because it fit well and I liked it, and I hadn't yet learned that in Vivian's world. Repeating an outfit in front of the right people was its own kind of confession. She looked at it, she looked at me, and she said loud enough for the whole table, in a voice pitched for an audience rather than a conversation, "Well, she's certainly ordinary, isn't she?" A few people laughed the way people laugh when they're deciding whether something was a joke. Holt laughed too, a short, nervous exhale, and reached for his wine instead of my hand. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth the scene. I told myself a lot of things over the next 2 years that I no longer believe. That wasn't the only time. 18 months before the wedding, Vivian hosted her annual Christmas party, the kind with 150 guests and a step-and-repeat banner and a coat check, staffed by 2 women in matching black vests. I wore a green wrap dress I'd bought for the occasion, the first new thing I'd bought myself in months, and Vivian looked at it when I walked in and said, "Interesting choice," in a tone that made 3 women near her go quiet. An hour later, I went to retrieve my coat to step outside for air, and it wasn't there. The coat check attendant apologized, flustered, and said it must have been moved. It turned up 4 hours later, at the very end of the night, in a closet on the 3rd floor. Nobody had any reason to visit. I spent the party in a cardigan Priya lent me from the staff closet, apologizing to guests for looking underdressed at a party I was appropriately dressed for. Holt found it funny, in the retelling, weeks later. "That's just Mom," he said. "She's disorganized about that stuff. She means well." I let it go. I had let a great many things go by then, filed under the heading of things that weren't worth becoming the woman who couldn't take a joke. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd already met the person who would hand me the truth about Vivian Sterling, 10 months before I needed it. It happened at a financial compliance conference in Hartford, one of those 2-day industry things with bad coffee and worse lanyards, where I sat on a panel about nonprofit fraud detection, and afterward talked shop in the hallway with a paralegal from a firm 2 states over named Denise Farrow. We traded cards. We talked in the vague, professionally cautious way people in fraud work talk about how often family foundations turn out to be the softest targets in the entire nonprofit sector, because nobody wants to believe the person whose name is on the building is stealing from it. I filed the conversation away as pleasant industry small talk and drove back to New York and didn't think about Denise Farrow again for months. By the time Holt proposed on a Tuesday in October, on the same rooftop where we'd met, I had a working theory about his mother that I kept mostly to myself, that Vivian Sterling had built her entire identity around being untouchable, and that everyone in her orbit, including her own sons, had quietly agreed to help her stay that way. I said yes to Holt because I loved him, and because in 5 years, he had never once, in private, been anything other than kind to me. I said yes knowing his mother would be a permanent weather system I'd have to learn to dress for. I did not yet know how much damage that weather system had already done, or how soon I'd be the one to measure it. The engagement lasted 22 months, and looking back, almost every month of it contained some version of the same test, dressed up differently each time. The first one came 6 weeks after Holt proposed. I'd I'd found a mid-sized venue in Westchester, a converted barn with good light and a reasonable price, and I was happy with it. Vivian invited us to lunch and spent 40 minutes describing Larkspur Hill Estate, a property 2 towns over from her own house, owned by family friends, with a lawn that photographed like a magazine. She didn't ask if we liked it. She said, "I've already spoken to the Whitfields and I'm covering the deposit," in the tone of someone announcing a decision rather than making a suggestion. Holt looked at me across the table, that particular look he got when he wanted me to just let his mother have this one. I let her have it. Larkspur Hill was, admittedly, beautiful. I told myself compromise wasn't the same as losing. The second test came 4 months later, in the form of a prenuptial agreement drafted by the Sterling family's longtime attorney, a stiff, silver-haired man named Preston Yates, who Vivian introduced as practically an uncle to Holt and a stranger to me. The draft was aggressive in ways only someone in my line of work would fully clock. A 10-year cliff before I'd have any claim to marital property, language waiving any interest, current or hypothetical, in assets held by or associated with the Sterling Family Foundation, and a clause that would have required me to forfeit even personal gifts given during the marriage if the split happened before year 5. I read it twice, flagged 9 separate provisions, and hired my own attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Rebecca Goldhammer, to negotiate it down to something fair. Vivian called the negotiation distasteful. She told Holt, within my hearing, that a woman who came in already lawyering up was telling him something about her true priorities. I signed the fair version 4 weeks later. I never once regretted having a lawyer of my own. I would need her again sooner than either of us expected. The third test was quieter, and it ran the whole length of the engagement in the background. Exclusion, dressed as forgetfulness. Vivian introduced me at parties as Holton's fiancé and left it there. No name, as if I hadn't earned one yet. She forgot to loop me into 3 separate family planning calls about the rehearsal dinner. When I brought it up to Holt, gently, he told me I was reading too much into it. And when I brought it up to Vivian directly, she teared up at her own kitchen table and said, "I just miss my son. Is that such a crime? You're taking him away from me, and I'm trying to hold on to what little time I have left with him." She was 62 and in excellent health. I apologized anyway, because that's what the room wanted from me, and I hated myself a little for doing it. The fourth test was the one that finally taught me what Vivian actually valued. 7 months before the wedding, she called a meeting. She called it a meeting, not a conversation, to discuss the guest list. She'd offered to cover $150,000 of the wedding budget, and she used that number like a lever. She wanted 22 seats reallocated from my side, mostly my father's co-workers and 2 cousins I'd grown up with, to make room for members of the Greenwich Historical Society Board and 3 families from her country club whose last names, she pointed out, carry weight in this town. I told her no. She told me that gratitude was apparently not a value I'd been raised with. My father, when I told him what happened, didn't get angry. He got quiet, and 2 days later he handed me a check for $18,000, his savings from a decade of overtime, and told me nobody was going to buy a say in his daughter's wedding, that he hadn't earned the right to have himself. I cried harder over that check than I did over anything Vivian ever said to me. I still have not spent it. I keep it framed. The 5th test I didn't fully understand until much later, and it started the same month as the 4th, though it looked at the time like nothing at all. 11 months before the wedding, on a Wednesday afternoon in March, my desk phone rang and a woman introduced herself as Denise Farrow, a paralegal at a firm in Hartford. I remembered her instantly. The compliance conference, the bad coffee, the hallway conversation about family foundations being the softest targets in the nonprofit sector. She told me her firm had a client who wanted to speak with someone in financial compliance off the record about a New England family foundation. She wouldn't say the name over the phone. I told her I'd meet whoever it was. I want to be honest about the moment my stomach dropped, because it happened before I knew any of the specifics. It happened when Denise said the word Connecticut. 2 weeks later, I sat across from a woman named Eleanor Wick at a coffee shop in Stamford, a modest place with mismatched chairs. Chosen, I understood later, specifically because no one from Greenwich would be caught dead in it. Eleanor was 66, silver-haired, dressed in a wool coat that had seen better winters. She'd sat on the board of the Sterling Family Foundation for 11 years. She slid 2 folders across the table before she'd even finished her coffee order. "I've stayed quiet longer than I'm proud of," she said. "I'm not staying quiet anymore." The folders held bank records, LLC formation documents, and a spreadsheet Eleanor had built herself late at night, cross-referencing board minutes against wire transfers she wasn't supposed to have access to, but had, because nobody had ever bothered to lock the right drawer. The pattern, even in that first look, was ugly. Scholarship money, hospital donation pledges, routed through shell companies with names built to sound like legitimate contractors, Whitmore Community Partners chief among them. And from there, into an account held in the Isle of Man that didn't carry Vivian Sterling's name anywhere on its paperwork, but did carry, buried 3 subsidiaries deep, the maiden name of Vivian's late mother. I didn't tell Holt. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't strategy, not at first. It was that I didn't yet have proof, only a folder and a furious, grieving board member, and I have spent my entire career watching what happens to people who make accusations before they can back them. I wasn't going to detonate my own engagement on a hunch, even a well-documented one. I was going to build a case the way I built every case, the way my job had trained me to, quietly, patiently, and with more evidence than anyone could argue with. I brought it to Owen Reyes first, a colleague colleague at my firm with 17 years chasing exactly this kind of fraud. I didn't tell him whose family it was. I gave him the numbers cold. He looked at the pattern for 10 minutes and said, "That's not an accident. Someone built this on purpose, and they built it well enough that they think nobody's smart enough to find it." I hired a forensic accountant next, a former FBI financial crimes analyst named Lionel Park, on my own dime, using money I'd saved for a kitchen renovation I no longer particularly wanted. Lionel spent 6 weeks tracing every transfer, every shell company, every dollar that had moved out of a fund meant for 18-year-olds from Bridgeport who couldn't otherwise afford college. His verdict, when it came, was 6 pages long and did not contain a single soft edge. Deliberate concealment. Consistent pattern. Not one honest number in the file. I hired Rebecca Goldhammer next, the same lawyer who'd fought my prenup down to something fair, and she reviewed the whole file twice, once as a formality and once, I think, because she wanted to be sure before she said the sentence she said to me in her office on a Tuesday in November. "This would survive scrutiny," she told me, "every bit of it, if you ever decide to use it." There was one night in early December when I almost told him. We were on his couch in Stamford, half watching a movie neither of us could later name, and he'd said something offhand about how excited his mother was to finally have another sterling wedding to plan, and something in my face must have shifted, because he paused the movie and asked what was wrong. I sat there for a long moment with 11 months of shell companies and wire transfers sitting behind my teeth close enough to taste, and I chose, one more time, to say it was nothing, just wedding stress. I told myself I was protecting the evidence, protecting the case, protecting him from having to carry something he couldn't yet prove and couldn't yet act on. All of that was true. It was also true that some smaller, more frightened part of me was protecting myself, because I didn't yet know what would happen to us the moment I said his mother's name out loud in that sentence, and I wasn't ready to find out. I've forgiven myself for that night. It took a while. He forgave me for it faster than I forgave myself, which tells you most of what you need to know about which one of us was ever the more generous partner in that relationship. I carried that file everywhere for the rest of my engagement, in a $2 plastic document holder from a drugstore, because a plain object draws no attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted it to draw. It sat in my bag at 3 separate family dinners. It sat on the passenger seat of my car during 4 trips to Greenwich. It sat, finally, on a side table at our rehearsal dinner, 2 nights before the wedding, while I went to find the coordinator about a timing question. When I came back, Vivian had it in her hands. "Cute little planner," she said, setting it down without opening it, smiling the smile she used on caterers and waitstaff. "You really are organized, aren't you?" She had no idea. I smiled back and said something about liking to keep lists. She had absolutely no idea. What I didn't know, standing in that room 2 nights before my wedding, was that Vivian's own smile had a crack running through it that I mistook, at the time, for ordinary bridal family stress. She'd been sharper than usual all week. She'd snapped at Priya twice over nothing. She'd canceled a final walkthrough with the florist and rescheduled it twice more. I filed it under wedding nerves, the same category I'd been filing her behavior in for 2 years. I was wrong about the category. I just didn't find out how wrong until it was almost too late to matter. The full shape of it came together over 6 weeks in October and November, in spreadsheets and phone calls, and one very long Saturday in Lionel Park's office in Stamford, going line by line through 18 months of transfers. By the time Lionel and Rebecca had finished, the picture was this. In March 3 years earlier, $847,000 had moved out of the Sterling Family Foundation's scholarship endowment through Whitmore Community Partners and into an account in the Isle of Man. In August of the following year, $1.2 million had followed the same route through 2 additional shell companies layered on top of the first, a little more careful the second time, a little more confident. Smaller transfers ran between and around those 2, a steady bleed rather than a single wound, dating back at least 5 years, back almost to the year Nathaniel Sterling died, and his widow inherited both his fortune and total unsupervised control of the foundation built on his name. Graham Sterling had signed off on quarterly reports the whole time, trusting the figures his mother's office prepared for him, never once auditing the family that trusted him back. I had the full file by the first week of December. The wedding was 6 weeks away. I told myself, again, that I wasn't going to detonate anything until I had to. I didn't yet know how soon "had to" would arrive, or that Vivian would be the one to set the timeline instead of me. It was Rebecca who called me the morning of the wedding, at 9:40, while I stood in the bridal suite at Larkspur Hill in a clown costume with a foam nose in my clutch, waiting for the processional to start. She'd meant to call with something simple, a final confirmation that the documentation package was ready to go, in case I decided, after the ceremony, to move forward with reporting it. But she led with something else, something she'd only learned herself the night before from a contact at her firm who did occasional work with Preston Yates's office. "Wren," she said, "I think you should know. 3 days ago, Yates's office received a federal document preservation letter, Foundation records. I don't know how much they know yet, but they know something. And I have a feeling Vivian does too." I stood there in red and white stripes, holding the phone, and felt the last piece of the last 11 months slide into place. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It had never only been that, not really, not even at the engagement dinner or the Christmas party, or any of the smaller, older insults I'd spent 2 years absorbing and excusing. Vivian Sterling had spent her whole life certain that money made a person unreachable, and 3 days before her son's wedding for the first time, something had reached her anyway. She didn't know it was me. I'm fairly sure of that, even now. I don't think she connected a compliance analyst fiancé to a federal preservation letter with any real precision. But she knew something was coming. She knew she couldn't stop it. And she did the only thing a woman like Vivian knows how to do when she feels the ground moving under her for the first time in 6 years. She reached for the nearest person smaller than her and tried to remind them, one last time, exactly where they stood. She stole my dress and left me a costume the same week she found out her entire fortune might not survive the year. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a woman trying to make herself feel large one final time before the world made her small. I put the phone down. I looked at my father, and for the first time since I'd found that note the night before, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Laughter rolled through 200 folding chairs like a wave breaking against a seawall. First a ripple, then a swell, then a full cresting sound that filled the tent. Phones came up in a row, screens catching the afternoon light. In the front row, in silver silk, Vivian Sterling sat with her hands folded in her lap and a smile on her face that I understood now, watching it from the aisle, as the smile of a woman who believed she'd just won something. She had been waiting for this moment, I think, since the night before. She'd built it herself, hung it on a padded hanger, and now she got to watch it play out exactly as she'd imagined. I kept walking. My heels didn't wobble once, not on the grass, not on the small wooden ramp up to the altar, not under 200 sets of eyes. My father's arm stayed steady under mine the entire way. Holt's face went through 3 distinct colors before I reached him. White first, then a blotchy, panicked red, then something closer to gray. He reached out and grabbed my wrist as I stepped up beside him, his grip harder than I think he meant it to be. "Go change," he hissed, low, urgent, his eyes darting to the crowd instead of to me. "Right now, please." "Into what?" I said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Your mother dressed me like a clown in front of everyone you know. There isn't a spare dress backstage, Holt. There's just this. And an explanation, if anyone's interested in one." Vivian rose from her seat, smoothing her silk skirt with one hand, and turned to face the officiant with the easy authority of a woman used to redirecting a room. "Let's proceed," she said, pitched to Carrie, "before this gets any more embarrassing for everyone." I turned to face her instead. 200 people went quiet again. A different kind of quiet than the laughter had been. The kind that happens when a room senses it's about to get something it didn't order. I reached into my clutch and took out the foam nose. I set it down gently on the altar, beside the unity candles, next to a small crystal vase of white peonies. I let it sit there a second before I looked up at her. "I've been looking forward to this," I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in 11 months. "Do you remember a board meeting in March 3 years ago? $847,000 moved out of the scholarship endowment through a company called Whitmore Community Partners into an account that doesn't have your name on it anywhere a normal person would think to look." Her smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "I watched it happen in real time, the way you watch a crack finish traveling across glass that's already been struck. Or maybe August, the following year," I said. $1.2 million. 3 shell companies this time instead of 1. You got more careful. You didn't get careful enough." The tent had gone fully, totally silent. 200 people holding one breath. 11 months of documentation, I said. "A forensic accountant who used to work federal fraud cases for the FBI. An attorney who's reviewed the file twice and told me it would survive scrutiny. A board member who sat across from me at a coffee shop in Stamford and slid 2 folders across a table because she couldn't watch this happen to Bridgeport kids who needed that scholarship money for tuition anymore, and a federal preservation letter that landed on your own attorney's desk 3 days ago, which I understand is why you were in such a generous mood last night." Vivian's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. In 4 years of knowing her, I had never once seen that happen. I opened my clutch again and lifted out the black folder, the same one she'd called a cute little planner 2 nights earlier, and held it up where the whole front half of the tent could see it. "Everything in this folder has already been sent to 3 people, I said. My attorney, a federal investigator who has had the full file for 6 weeks, and a financial reporter who has been quietly building the same story from a different angle for months, and who, as of this morning, has confirmation from a second independent source." I let that land. "You didn't lose a wedding dress last night, Vivian. You lost the only thing you actually had left to threaten me with." She sat back down, not gracefully. Her legs simply stopped holding her up, and the chair happened to be there to catch her. I looked around the tent, at 200 frozen faces, at Graham Sterling 3 rows back with his hand pressed flat over his mouth, at Holt still holding my wrist like letting go might make any of it less true. I looked, last, at my father, whose eyes were wet in a way I'd only seen twice before in my life. "You wanted me to know my place," I said, to Vivian, to the tent, to the 11 months of folders and phone calls and quiet patient work that had led to this exact spot of grass. "So here it is. I'm standing in a clown costume you bought, holding a federal fraud case in my hand, asking the only question left worth asking." I let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. I'd earned every one of them. Which one of us is the joke? Nobody laughed that time. The wedding did not continue. There was no version of that afternoon where it could have. The officiant, a soft-spoken woman who had married 3 of my cousins and had clearly never in her career watched a bride hold up a federal fraud folder at the altar, quietly stepped back and let the day end the only only way it could. Guests filtered out of the tent in clusters, phones still raised, some of them whispering to each other in the particular hush of people who know they've just watched something that will be talked about at every dinner party in that zip code for a year. My father walked me back up the aisle the way we'd walk down it, except this time nobody laughed. And by the top of the stairs, Mina had already found me a change of clothes from somewhere, jeans and a sweater that belonged to Tess. And I got out of that costume for the last time behind a folding screen while my hands finally started shaking. Vivian tried, before she left the tent, to say something to the remaining guests, standing up in her silver silk and raising a hand for quiet the way she had at 100 galas before this one. Almost nobody quieted down for her. A caterer's assistant, a young man I never learned the name of, was the one who finally walked over and told her, not unkindly, that the venue needed the tent cleared within the hour for another event booked that evening, which was true, and which was also, I think, the first time in a very long time that anyone had spoken to Vivian Sterling as though her schedule mattered less than someone else's. Constance, Vivian's own sister, gathered her purse and left without a word to her, the first sign of the family split that would widen for the next year. A woman I recognized from the country club, one of the 3 families Vivian had tried to buy seats for at my cousin's expense, came up to me on her way out and said only, "I've wondered about that woman's finances for 15 years. I'm glad someone finally had the nerve." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thank you because it seemed to be what she wanted, and because it was, in its own strange way, true. The consequences moved faster than I expected, and slower than I wanted, in the way real consequences almost always do. Rebecca filed the documentation package formally with federal investigators the following Monday, though as she'd told me on the phone that morning, most of it had already been in a federal investigator's hands for 6 weeks. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a case within the month, working alongside the Connecticut Attorney General's office on the state-level tax fraud angle. Within 8 weeks, the Sterling Family Foundation's accounts were frozen pending investigation, which meant the spring scholarship disbursement, the one meant for 11 Bridgeport High School seniors, had to be covered instead by an emergency fund Eleanor Wick organized among 3 other board members within 72 hours of the freeze, because none of them, whatever else they'd failed to catch, were willing to let 11 kids lose their tuition money over Vivian's math. The cardiac wing at Greenwich General kept Nathaniel Sterling's name on it, for now, though the hospital's board opened its own quiet review of every past donation the family had made, and the plaque outside the entrance has an asterisk next to it now, in the form of a line on the hospital's website about an ongoing internal audit that wasn't there before. Vivian did not go quietly. I want to be fair to what that fight looked like, because it wasn't a single scene, it was months of small, escalating moves, each one a little more desperate than the last. First came the lawyers, a crisis firm out of New York with a name I recognized from 3 other scandals, and a statement calling the allegations the product of a jilted, jealous outsider attempting to manufacture relevance. Then came the private investigator Vivian hired to look into my own finances, on the theory, I assume, that a compliance analyst engaged to her son must have some skeleton worth finding. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find, and I know that because Rebecca told me 2 months later that the investigator had quietly reached out to her, off the record, admitting as much. Somewhere between the private investigator and the late-night calls, someone from the crisis firm placed an anonymous complaint with the compliance division at my own employer, alleging that I'd used privileged client information to build a personal vendetta against a family with no connection to any account I'd ever worked. It was a serious enough allegation that my firm was obligated to investigate it, which meant 3 days of internal review, a temporary hold on 2 of my active files, and a conversation with my managing director that I will remember for the rest of my career, not because it went badly, but because of exactly how quickly it went well. I'd built my entire case on my own time, with my own money, using a forensic accountant and an attorney I'd hired personally, specifically so that no one could ever make the argument someone was now trying to make. The review cleared me in 4 business days. Owen Reyes, when he heard where the complaint had likely originated, laughed out loud in the break room, hard enough that 2 people came to see what had happened. "They tried to get you fired for doing the thing that's literally your job," he said, using better methodology than most of our actual clients. My managing director, I later learned, made a note in my file that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with a promotion I got the following spring. Then came the calls to Holt, late at night, according to what he told me afterward. Calls where she alternated between crying and threatening to disinherit him if he didn't publicly denounce me. Calls where she told him I had engineered the entire relationship from the beginning to get access to Sterling money, a claim so far from anything resembling my actual bank account that I almost laughed when I heard it. Holt did not denounce me. That part surprised people more than it surprised me, though it took him longer than I would have liked to get there. For the first 2 weeks, he was somewhere between shattered and useless, unable to fully believe his mother capable of what 6 weeks of forensic accounting had already proven beyond reasonable argument. He asked me, more than once, whether I could have somehow gotten it wrong, and I understood the question wasn't really about the evidence. It was about a 33-year-old man discovering that the woman who raised him had built half his adult identity on money that didn't belong to her. The turn came from an unexpected direction. Graham, his older brother, the one who'd trusted their mother's quarterly reports without question for 6 years, pulled the original board minutes himself one weekend, cross-referencing referenced them against Lionel Park's timeline out of what he later described as sheer disbelief and called Holt at 11 at night, unable to finish full sentences. Graham resigned from the foundation board within the week, cooperated fully with investigators, and told a reporter from the Financial Times, on the record, that he'd rather see the foundation dissolved and rebuilt from nothing than watch it keep his mother's name attached to it. After that call, Holt stopped asking me whether I might be wrong. Priya, the housekeeper who'd lent me her cardigan 2 Christmases before mine got misplaced, turned out to have kept a running log of household incidents for years, out of what she told investigators was simple self-preservation, the kind of record-keeping people learn to do when they've watched enough things happen in a house that no one upstairs wants to remember happening. It corroborated more than anyone expected, including 2 dates that lined up precisely with wire transfers Lionel had already flagged. Days Vivian had told Priya to keep the study locked and to tell no one, including her sons, who had stopped by. Eleanor Wick, once her name became public, got the kind of vindication that comes 11 years too late to feel entirely like a victory, though she told me over coffee the second time we met that watching those 11 Bridgeport kids get their scholarship checks on time felt close enough. Denise Farrow sent me a card. I still have it. Mina and Tess never once treated the whole ordeal like the spectacle everyone else seemed to want it to be. Mina took 2 personal days that first week just to sit in my apartment while I made phone calls to vendors and lawyers, ordering takeout I didn't have the energy to choose myself, and answering my phone when reporters started finding my number. Tess, who worked in event planning and knew exactly how the industry gossip machine operated, quietly got ahead of 3 different attempts by wedding blogs to track down guest photos for a Bridezilla meltdown story, calling in favors with photographers and coordinators she'd worked with for years until the narrative that stuck, in the small circles where it mattered, was the true one instead of the cruel one. Neither of them ever asked me to perform gratitude for any of it, which I've come to understand in the years since is the actual definition of a real friend. Someone who helps you and then simply moves on to the next thing that needs doing, without waiting around to be thanked for it. I saw Vivian in person exactly once after the wedding, in the hallway outside the federal courthouse in Bridgeport, the day of her arraignment. She was flanked by 2 attorneys and dressed, even then, in a coat that probably cost more than my father's first car. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in some other way I didn't have a precise word for at the time, and have since decided to just call diminished. She saw me. I watched her decide, in real time, whether to say something, and I watched her decide against it, which was, I think, the single most self-aware choice I ever saw her make in 4 years of knowing her. I didn't say anything either. There wasn't a version of that hallway exchange that would have given either of us anything we actually needed. We passed each other in silence, and I kept walking, and that was the last time I have seen Vivian Sterling's face anywhere, except in a folder of court documents. I testified before a federal grand jury in Bridgeport that September, in a windowless room that felt nothing like the courtroom dramas had prepared me for, mostly folding tables and fluorescent light and a court reporter who typed faster than I could think. I spent 4 hours walking an assistant U.S. attorney through the same documents I already knew by heart: the Whitmore Community Partners paperwork, the Isle of Man account records, the spreadsheet Eleanor had built at her kitchen table 2 years running. I was not asked a single question about the wedding or the costume or Vivian's note because none of that mattered to the case, which was, I think, the moment I finally understood the difference between the story people wanted to watch and the actual mechanism of justice that had been quietly grinding along underneath it the entire time. The wedding got the headlines. The spreadsheet got the conviction. I've made my peace with which of those 2 things I'm actually proud of. The case is a training example now at 2 different compliance programs I know of. Stripped of names, taught as a model of how a small family foundation can hide a large, sustained fraud behind exactly the kind of trust nobody wants to be the one to question first. I got asked to guest lecture about it once, at a graduate program in Hartford, and stood in front of 40 students explaining shell company structures using a version of the story that left out every detail about clown costumes or wedding altars, focusing instead on the parts that actually mattered to their future careers. How long it takes to build an airtight file, how much of fraud detection is just refusing to let a plausible explanation substitute for an actual answer, and how the people see and closest to a fraud are so often the last ones willing to see it. Not because they're foolish, but because believing it would cost them something they aren't ready to lose. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, in a quiet week between depositions, I sat in my apartment on a Tuesday night and let myself grieve something I hadn't expected to grieve. The mother-in-law I never got to have. Not the real Vivian, but the idea of her. The version I'd hoped for in the early months. Back when I still believed 2 years of small cruelties might eventually soften into something warmer, the way people tell you it sometimes does. My own mother had been gone 12 years by then, and some small, unreasonable part of me had wanted Vivian, even Vivian, to be some kind of replacement, however imperfect. She never was going to be. I think I'd known that longer than I let myself admit. I cried for an hour that night, not for the wedding, and not even entirely for Louise, but for the specific, ordinary thing I'd wanted and never gotten. A woman on the other side of my marriage who was simply, quietly glad I existed. I let myself have the hour. Then I went back to work the next morning, because 11 Bridgeport seniors still needed their scholarship letters finalized, and grief, I've learned, doesn't require you to stop being useful careful while you carry it. The wedding vendors took another 4 months to sort out. Larkspur Hill kept half the deposit, which Vivian had paid and which her attorneys, in a final petty flourish, tried briefly to bill to me before Rebecca's letter made clear exactly how that conversation was going to go if they pursued it. The photographer, mortified, offered to void the entire contract rather than deliver 200 photographs of a bride in a clown costume, and I told her to send them anyway. I have all 412 of them in a folder on my laptop. I look at maybe 6 of them, ever. They're the 6 where I'm not smiling for anyone, where my face just looks like a woman who has finally completely stopped asking a room's permission to be angry. The criminal case took just over a year to resolve. Vivian was indicted the following spring on 11 counts: wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy among them, and after 4 months of her attorneys threatening a trial that would supposedly expose the whole truth about my motives, she took a plea deal that included restitution of the full amount, a suspended sentence contingent on 5 years of probation, and a permanent ban from serving on the board of any nonprofit organization registered in the state of Connecticut. The Financial Times ran the full story 2 weeks after the plea, 3,200 words, with my name in it exactly once, in a single sentence describing how the initial documentation had been provided to federal investigators by a source connected to the family. I'd asked, through Rebecca, to stay out of the piece as much as possible, and the reporter, to her credit, honored that. The Greenwich Time was less careful, and for about 6 weeks I couldn't walk into a coffee shop in that town without somebody's head turning. I stopped going to that town for a while. Extended families split along lines that surprised almost no one who'd spent any real time around the Sterlings. Vivian's sister, an 81-year-old woman named Constance, who'd never much liked her either, sent me a card that said simply, "About time someone did," which I keep in the same drawer as Denise Farrow's. Several of Vivian's country club friends, the same women whose seats she'd tried to buy with my cousin's invitations, distanced themselves from her within the month, less out of any moral clarity than a simple practiced instinct for which way the social wind had turned. A few stayed loyal, mostly the ones who'd benefited from her patronage in ways that made loyalty easier than honesty. Holt lost some of them too, by association, and I watched him grieve that in his own quiet way, not because he missed people he'd never particularly liked, but because losing them meant admitting, one more time, how much of his life had been built on infrastructure his mother controlled. Holt's own reckoning took the better part of that year. He left his position at the family's real estate arm 4 months after the wedding. That wasn't, not fired, not forced out, but unable to keep sitting in an office his mother's money had built while federal investigators combed through the foundation 2 floors up. He took a job at a mid-sized development firm in Stamford, at a salary about a third of what he'd made before, and told me, the night he signed the offer, that it was the first paycheck of his adult life he was fully certain he'd earned. I believed him. I'd watched him do the work to earn that certainty, which is more than I can say for most people who talk about starting over. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from mine. We didn't rush back into anything. We went to dinner 4 times before either of us said the word wedding out loud again, and even then, neither of us meant it as a plan. It was just a word we were slowly getting brave enough to use. The logistics of it all took longer to untangle than the emotions did. In the strange way practical matters always outlast the feelings that cause them. There were 200 wedding gifts to return, most of which people insisted on letting us keep once they heard the full story, and 11 that came back with notes so kind I still have them in a shoebox. There was a security deposit dispute with Larkspur Hill that dragged into the following winter. There was a joint bank account Holt and I had opened together 8 months before the wedding, meant for shared expenses, that neither of us had the heart to close, which in retrospect might have been the clearest signal either of us gave the other that this wasn't actually over, whatever it looked like from a folding chair in that tent. There was, eventually, a conversation with my own father, over dinner at his kitchen table in Dayton, where I asked him whether he thought I'd done the right thing, wearing that costume down the aisle instead of quietly calling the whole day off from a hotel room. He didn't answer right away. He finished his coffee first, the way he does when he wants a question to have weighed something before he responds to it. "Your mother would have worn it too," he said finally. "She never let anybody tell her where to stand." That was the only time I cried in front of him about any of it. It was worth the wait. Holt and I got married 14 months after the day the wedding didn't happen. It was small, 31 people, a backyard in Rhinebeck belonging to Mina's aunt, a caterer we found through a friend of a friend, and a dress I bought off the rack in an afternoon because I never wanted to hang another wedding dress on a padded hanger and hand its safety over to anyone but myself. My father walked me down a much shorter aisle that time, and he cried before I did, which had never once happened at any point in my entire life before that afternoon. Graham came and brought his wife and their 2 kids and stood up during the toast to say, in a voice that still catches when he tells it, that some families you're born into and some families you have to go find later, on purpose, and that he was grateful I'd let him be part of both versions of his. Vivian was not invited. That sentence still costs something to write, even now, even knowing exactly what it cost to arrive at it. Mina gave the toast that day, standing under string lights in Mina's aunt's backyard with a glass of Prosecco shaking slightly in her hand, and she told the 31 people gathered there that she'd stood next to me at the worst wedding in the history of Fairfield County and the best one in the history of anywhere, and that the difference between the two had never once been about the dress. Tess cried through the whole thing, which surprised no one, least of all Tess. My father wore the same tie he'd worn 14 months earlier, at the wedding that wasn't, a small blue one with a pattern of tiny compass points that had belonged to my grandfather, and when I asked him about it that morning, he told me he'd worn it the first time on purpose, as a kind of promise to himself that he'd get the chance to wear it again properly, and he hadn't wanted to break in a new one. Holt didn't give a speech. He just found me near the end of the night, after most of the toasts were done, and the small rented speaker system had moved on to music nobody was really dancing to yet, and told me, quietly, that he was sorry it had taken him as long as it had to become a person worth marrying. I told him I'd take the version of him that showed up over the version that would have gotten there faster and meant it less. We live in Stamford now, in a 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen too small for the renovation I once imagined and gave up saving for, which turned out fine, because I like the kitchen we actually have. I still work in financial compliance, though I moved firms about a year ago, drawn by a team that specializes almost entirely in nonprofit fraud, which I like to think isn't a coincidence, even if I've never said that out loud to the people who hired me. Holt is still at the development firm in Stamford, 3 promotions in, and he still tells people, when it comes up, exactly what happened to his family's foundation, and exactly why, without flinching, without the old deflecting laugh he used to reach for whenever his mother's name came up in a room. Eleanor Wick and I have coffee every few months, at the same mismatched chair place in Stamford, where she first slid 2 folders across the table and changed the rest of my life. The scholarship fund got rebuilt under new independent trustees, with Graham as an unpaid advisor and Eleanor as chair, and it gave out 14 awards last spring instead of 11, which is the kind of math I think about more than almost any other number from that whole year. Vivian is somewhere in the middle of her probation, living, as far as I know, in a smaller house than the one on the circular driveway, though I've stopped tracking the details closely, because I found, somewhere in that second year, that I didn't need the ending to include her decline for it to feel complete. I don't forgive her exactly. I've made a kind of peace with what happened that doesn't require the word forgiveness at all, a peace built more out of distance than out of grace, which I've decided is allowed to be enough. The original dress turned up eventually, in the spring after the plea deal, in a storage unit Vivian had rented under a cousin's name in Port Chester, along with a handful of other things investigators were combing through for unrelated reasons. It was undamaged, still in its garment bag, tag still on. Rebecca asked if I wanted it shipped to me. I told her to donate it instead, to a nonprofit in Bridgeport that lends out formal wear to girls who can't otherwise afford it for prom, and I've never once regretted that it's out there somewhere on some 18-year-old's body doing something useful, instead of hanging in the back of my closet as a souvenir of the worst night of Vivian Sterling's careful, controlled life. The clown costume I kept. It's folded in a box on the top shelf of our bedroom closet, and every so often when I'm looking for something else entirely, my hand brushes the red and white stripes, and I let myself remember, for exactly as long as it takes to find whatever I was actually looking for, the precise sound 200 people make when they stop laughing all at once. Here's the thing I'd tell you. If you were sitting across from me the way Eleanor sat across from me that first afternoon in Stamford, 2 folders and a bad cup of coffee between us. People like Vivian Sterling build entire lives on the idea that some people are simply built to take up less room, less space at the table, less say in the guest list, less of a name when you're introduced at a party. They test that theory quietly, for years, in small humiliations easy to excuse one at a time. A coat that goes missing for an evening, a dress that gets called ordinary in front of 12 people, a folder mistaken for a planner. And they only find out how wrong they were when someone finally stops excusing it and starts documenting it instead. I didn't destroy Vivian Sterling's family in front of 200 guests because I wanted a viral moment or a good story to tell. I did it because 11 Bridgeport kids needed their scholarship money, because my father had handed me $18,000 he'd earned wiring houses for 30 years so that no one could buy a say in my life he hadn't paid for honestly, and because a woman decided, the night before my wedding, that the way to remind me of my place was to strip away the one day I'd spent 2 years planning for myself. She wanted me small. I have never in my life felt larger than I did standing at that altar in a foam nose and a costume with red and white stripes, holding up a folder that told the truth louder than any dress ever could. I still think sometimes about what that day could have been instead. A mother-in-law who liked me, a toast that didn't require a lawyer's phone number in my clutch, a version of Holt's family that simply let me belong to it. I let myself miss that version sometimes, the same quiet, occasional way I still miss my own mother, who never got to meet Holt at all, who would have liked him, I think, and would have had absolutely nothing polite to say about Vivian. Something real was lost that day at Larkspur Hill, a fantasy I'd been quietly building since the night Holt proposed, and I don't pretend the ending erased that loss just because it also delivered something like justice, but I know my place now. I always did, actually. I just needed a folder, a foam nose, and 200 witnesses to say it out loud where nobody could pretend they hadn't heard me.